Good afternoon. This is a short talk in light of the problems between US and China recently. By recently, I mean May 2019. I have titled it Trump and China, the Art of the Deal or Clumsy Bullying, ? With the most recent spat between China and the US, not uncharacteristically, if unintentionally engineered by Trump's announcement of increasing tariffs from 10% to 25%, unless China would agree to his deal, whatever that may be, we seem to be back to the drawing board in the ongoing US-China trade war. And this is worrying, not the least because US and China are very important trading partners. Both sides have a lot to lose from a suspension of trading as usual. And we are right now heading towards a path, or heading down a path, we might even say, where a trade war, a full-blown trade war, is the most likely scenario in the near future. We should also recognize that because both the US and China are very big, they are the two biggest economies in the world, it will not be easy for the rest of the world to adjust to this if growth slows in both the countries. So this is very worrying, not just for the US and China, but also for the rest of the world. It is important also to cast our net a little more broadly and think of it in international relations terms. Trade is only one part of international relations. Even more narrowly, it's one part of international economic relations. But like everything else, trade is also political, and clearly there are political elements there. So within the broad umbrella, or under the broad umbrella of international relations, US may be called a status quo power and China a rising power. Although Chinese have been affirming time and again their intention to rise peacefully, they are not oblivious to the fact that they are rising. Whereas for the US, there are a number of views from the neoconservative view, which wants to see America resurgent, which has an echo, if not an answer, in Trump's Make America Great Again. And it probably not is an accidental fact that many of the neocon people have found their way back into the Trump administration and are almost determining policies at times. But leaving that aside, Trump's own brand of conservatism, if we can call it, may have something in common with traditional American conservative isolationism, which is in some ways an echo back to the times of George Washington. When George Washington left office, he warned Americans against entanglements with Europe's affairs because US at that time was not even a rising power. It was a struggling nation state in its infancy. And all the founding fathers, except perhaps Jefferson, but one cannot be too sure of that, basically thought that US should develop economically behind a wall of tariffs, which was the main architect of this policy was, of course, Alexander Hamilton, and his famous report on manufactures of 1790 outlined pretty well how US should protect its infant industries against Europe and grow peacefully against a tariff wall, or under the protection or behind a tariff wall. And that's what US did exactly for a long time. And Trump is not too wrong, although his history is a bit sketchy at times, or most of the times. He's not really wrong in saying that US actually grew by tariff, although I'm sure he would be hard put to point out the exact mechanisms of how that growth occurred when it did occur. And it didn't occur all the time, too. Economic historians will also point that out. But there is an element of that conservatism, although not the nuances and not the kind of subtle tactical maneuvering that any reading of American economic and political history from late 18th century onwards would show. And also, Trump seems to have forgotten why the US changed direction from the depth of the Depression onwards and formulated the policy of free multilateral trade and implemented it largely, although not perfectly, after the end of the Second World War. So in some ways, what we today call neoliberalism, although this is very different from the liberalism of Franklin Delano Roosevelt or Truman or even Eisenhower or even Nixon for that matter, has kind of an echo of free multilateral trade that was agreed upon in principle by the major powers at the end of the Second World War. But of course, what happened with neoliberalism is that instead of being helped by it, much of the US working class, especially in the older industries, were hurt by it. And after voting for the Democrats for a few rounds, enough of them lost enough faith so that some of them at least went and voted for Trump, believing that Trump would do something different, which he actually has, to be fair to him, but it doesn't seem to have helped that many people. But Trump is indeed very lucky. He would deny it, of course. He would put it to his clever policies, but we are very hard put to actually see what is clever in the policies that he had actually announced, and what other policies there are other than these policies of protectionism. The growth in the US economy basically has taken place because of the policies that were put in place before Trump came into power in 2016. And sure enough, they will also go out pretty soon. They will fizzle out unless something is done to change things. And then we will see how smart the Trump administration economists really are. So I'm willing to have an open mind about this right now. But what is of interest now is actually the Trump's much vaunted negotiating skills, or what he called in his book, The Art of the Deal. So what do professionals actually think of his skills? Well, here is somebody who is a former FBI crisis negotiator. His name is James Massey. And James Massey may be closer to the truth than my academic colleagues in the instance of Trump and his negotiating with the Chinese. Massey is not convinced that US President Donald Trump has the, and this is quoting him, discipline or patience, or an appreciation for the strategic instruments that successful international relations require, end of the quote. I confess that I'm only an economist, but I have been studying, unlike many of my economist colleagues, the findings of the rapidly advancing field of cognitive science and cognitive psychology. And if we go by the findings of these sciences, which are actually advancing very rapidly in the 21st century, we find that the tendency of Trump to bully people into submission is not something that can work unless you already have people in a submitting position to begin with. And if we look at Trump's record, such as it is, because it is very sketchy, he doesn't seem to want to reveal too much about his business dealings, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt. and say he was successful in some instances. At least he has been successful in firing, some people on various occasions. Clearly, these are instances of people who are already subordinate to him, and they could not say no for whatever that he asked, because the consequence of saying no would be basically to be shown the door out. And that's exactly what has happened to people who have shown even a tiny bit of independence. And maybe that reality show that Trump ran was the right setting where he could fire anybody at will, and he did. Okay, but the US government even does not really always work that way, and certainly the Chinese government doesn't work that way, and Chinese are not ready to bend to Trump's will whenever he fancies that they should. Now, what really is going on there? In the international arena, if we extend this logic that I just articulated, then US influence, whether it is manipulated by Trump or somebody else, can only work when the opponents are much weaker than the US in economic and military terms. The crucial factors on the other side, I think, are minimum defense capability and political will to withstand pressure. And this is important because another thing that is going on right now is threat against Iran. Even Iraq or Afghanistan, which definitely is a country that didn't have the minimum defense capability, so it was easy to invade and even occupy, although not for very long. There used to be a saying that Kabul, the government of Afghanistan, which was run at that time by a man named Hamid Karzai, they said Hamid Karzai basically was the mayor of Kabul, and that too only during the daytime. At nighttime, the rebels came back and took over. And today, more than 50% of the territory of Afghanistan, according to our own analysts, more than 50% of the territory in Afghanistan is directly under the control of Taliban, a group that we ostensibly went to eradicate when we did go into Afghanistan, which, by the way, is the longest war in the history of our country. So what about China? China is not a weak opponent. I think that is a statement that almost everybody could agree with. Even Trump, I think, would agree with it. It also has more than minimum defense capability and plenty of political will to withstand pressure from bullies like Trump and his cronies. Trump and his gang may have met more than their match in Chinese leadership under Xi. Such is also the verdict of experts in psychological warfare, and they have long experience on the US side fighting psychological warfare, and for the most part winning it. According to these experts, Trump's default negotiating style that consists of bombast, threats, and litigation domestically may be largely ineffective internationally against leaders like Xi. All evidence also points to another major difference between Trump and Xi. While the latter seems to be good at focused listening, that may be the key to dealing with tense negotiations, Trump seems inattentive to details, narcissistic, and intent on humiliating his adversaries. That is not the surest path to global leadership when the relative power of the US is nowhere near what it was immediately after World War II. After World War II, US economically, militarily, and politically dominated. It was far ahead of anyone else. And as an aside, or maybe not so much of an aside, but as a relevant point really, we can add that this whole plan, neoconservative plan, to make America so dominant that nobody would dare to come near America, was both historically uninformed and in fact patently foolish. Because we have spent all these resources, we have not collected the peace dividend that actually we could have collected, we have not advanced or even repaired our infrastructure, we have not improved our educational system, We have not done the kind of regulation of the financial sector that we need to do. I can mention a number of things that we could have done better and we haven't done. And much of that goes back into this single-minded pursuit of military and diplomatic dominance internationally. And future historians, I'm sure, will analyze this and will be wondering what went wrong in the US in the 1990s, that such foolish policies were undertaken by people who were supposedly very intelligent and experts in their chosen fields. But coming back to the present debacle, we see that we are not in a very good position given the kind of leadership we have right now. A reality check should suggest working multilaterally with other global leaders in mutually respectful and beneficial partnership. Unfortunately, that is not the art of the deal that Trump administration cares about very much. So, what is likely to happen? I'm not so eager to predict possibilities, especially in light of how wrong my colleagues have been in this fraught area. But if I had to bet, I would put my money on the proposition that China will keep the doors open for negotiation, and that indeed is good news. But the bad news is that China will never submit to bullies like Trump. There must be analysts in Washington and in the US universities and think tanks who have read the history of the Chinese Revolution and the role both nationalist and anti-imperialist ideas played in this process. The Chinese fought patiently a long political and military anti-imperialist war to liberate their country. They don't own the rest of the world very much, actually, to be quite frank and clear-eyed about this. Whatever differences may exist among the leadership in China and within the Chinese people, they will be united against foreign bullying and pressure. We see that happening already. And Xi is not as free to negotiate and give away whatever Trump wants him to give away. Meaningful negotiations, therefore, with China can begin only if the US and other powers recognize this historically based cognitive reality. Thank you.